Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us here today for this session. My name is Jim Hansen. I'm the Vice President of Product Strategy for Applications, Systems, and Security here at SolarWinds. We're going to discuss some lessons that we learned from the federal government about reducing vulnerabilities and improving compliance. I'm here today with Dave Richards from the Regional Cyber Center at the Army National Guard. He's a subject matter expert on this topic, and I'm thrilled to have him here with me today. So Dave, would you mind taking just a couple minutes to share with the audience a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Jim. I have a long history of government service. I actually retired from the U.S. Army after 20 years and then just continued working for the DoD as a government contractor. Before my current position as the technical lead for the National Guard Bureau, I was actually working overseas in South Korea as the lead information assurance engineer and network manager. Both of those positions gave me a lot of experience working with very large networks. And let's face it, the government always has the best toys.
Okay, so let's get going. Dave, I understand that the Army National Guard network is perhaps the largest federal network in existence. I would love to put that into perspective for our audience. Can you just take a moment and describe that network?
For our network, it covers 54 states, territories, and the District of Columbia. And there are over 3,000 separate locations. It spans 11 time zones, and we have over 450,000 customers.
Monitoring a network of that size really can't be that easy. So what's your secret? How do you do it?
Well, you're right. It's a big challenge, but we've been very successful, and a large part of that is how we leverage SolarWinds Orion to help us automate our monitoring requirements. We actually have 6 products that we're currently using: Network Configuration Manager, Network Performance Monitor, Server and Application Monitor, VoIP and Network Quality Manager, IP Address Manager, and Network Topology Mapper. Network Configuration Manager meets STIG requirements by providing a repository for capturing and storing our configurations. And we use web-based reports to track changes over time as part of our configuration management plan. We use a combination of Network Performance Monitor and Server and Application Monitor as our go-to products for near real-time performance and status monitoring of our network devices and data center VMs. These 2 products fit nicely into our security requirements for a continuous monitoring plan. When we talk about VoIP and Network Quality Manager, there's obvious uses for that for your voice over IP and your quality of service. But we found a lot of value in using Cisco SLA at our boundary routers between the enterprise and state networks to generate synthetic transactions to simulate end user experience for multiple products. It turns out this is a great way to evaluate the performance of specific services and protocols, and you don't need to have an end user host as a system to test against.
So that is an incredibly impressive SolarWinds deployment. Are you doing everything that you want today, or do you have more plans to expand your monitoring in the future?
More is planned, and expansion is definitely part of our future plans. At the state level, there are 48 separate SolarWinds platforms performing internal interstate monitoring, and we also have our enterprise level SolarWinds platform. So the next logical step that we would like to do is to pull all that information together under a single platform, so we have a one-stop shop to access all monitoring information for both the enterprise and the state.
A few minutes ago, you mentioned that one of your key objectives is to apply a continuous monitoring approach to your monitoring program. The National Institutes of Standards and Technology have developed a guideline under NIST Special Publication 800-37 to mandate continuous monitoring. So what exactly is continuous monitoring, and more importantly, what isn't it?
Continuous monitoring is typically a combination of components, both manual and automated. Some are periodic on a recurring schedule, and others are running all the time.
So how does SolarWinds help you with your continuous monitoring objectives?
It provides several different layers of compliance for us. It provides near real-time monitoring status, and we use periodic reports to identify vulnerabilities and configuration violations. For our command cyber readiness inspection compliance preparation, we use Network Configuration Manager to push global configuration updates. It's very efficient and eliminates human error. SolarWinds reports also provide us capacity and availability metrics for our security devices. And then we also use the SolarWinds Alert Manager to meet STIG requirements for automated alert notifications. And those are done through email alerts.
Okay, so a key takeaway here for me is that continuous monitoring is important. It's an approach that strengthens a security monitoring program, and it allows you to maintain compliance and ensures that security vulnerabilities and misconfigurations and inappropriate behaviors don't creep in unexpectedly. Let's dig a little bit further into the point you mentioned regarding DISA-STIG. So I understand that you use SolarWinds to help you meet your DISA-STIG requirements. Can you explain how and how it helps you improve your IT security and compliance there at the Army National Guard?
DISA-STIGs, the Security Technical Implementation Guides, have detailed implementation information, and they also include required configuration script elements. So, Network Configuration Manager is the ideal choice to deploy global changes, and that's what we use to check for compliance and also push updates to all of our network devices. So anytime we can automate a task and reduce overall workload, we consider that a big win. One of the things I find useful is to think about how I want to use SNMP data that we collect as database elements, and how we are going to sort and select specific information on nodes or interfaces. That's why it's important to develop a good naming scheme that offers multiple ways to query the database. As an example, I use a string of standardized information elements for interface descriptions that I can use for various database queries. I can select by state, site, provider, circuit ID, and more. You may be wondering how I selected all the information elements for the naming scheme. Well, I found it really important to interview different service owners on my team to determine what was important to them and how that would fit into generating SolarWinds reports. So having a solid structure for our naming scheme was the only way to handle the large amount of data and allow database queries to do the hard work of selecting the proper information for us. One of the limitations I ran into was the number of characters that the MIB would allow for SNMP polling. Fortunately, there's a Cisco command to expand the number of characters from 64 to 256, and that's plenty for a long string to have a lot of different data elements in the naming scheme. We used Network Configuration Manager to apply the command globally to all network devices.
Okay, I get it. Naming conventions matter, especially when dealing with data coming in from lots of devices in lots of different locations. How does this ultimately help you achieve your compliance obligations for DISA-STIG?
So, probably to restate it, but we use Network Configuration Manager to collect and store configurations to meet STIG historical repository requirements. We use Network Configuration Manager to support our configuration management plan by generating configuration change reports. And those reports are very easy to use because they're built in and intuitive, and you can edit them easily. And we establish configuration baselines, and we can use those to compare to the running configurations for compliance validation. So previously, DISA command cyber readiness inspections used to be conducted on an annual basis, but all that has changed recently to more frequent inspections, and that also includes unannounced inspections. This means that our CCRI preparation must be continuous because you never know when you're going to get inspected. As I mentioned earlier, Network Configuration Manager is the ideal tool to automate compliance tasks. We use it to push global configuration updates, and this provides a very efficient, consistent level of compliance that also eliminates human error.
So SolarWinds helps you execute on a continuous monitoring strategy and meet your compliance obligations both under DISA-STIG, and also your cyber readiness inspections. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about how you use data collected by SolarWinds within your massive infrastructure to provide visibility to your IT people, your security operations, and management teams. I believe you call it Oculus. What is Oculus?
Oculus is a concept for how to create meaningful heads-up monitoring displays, and we actually developed that over time. These work well in a network's operations center environment. It stands for Operational Cyber Urgency Listing utilizing SolarWinds. And I'll tell you that at work, when you come up with an acronym like that, you get extra points.
I like it.
So the idea is to develop tools that display important information for a specific service. It's really a departure from the old method of monitoring what we would call just the boxes. Mm-hmm. That may only include a part of the complete picture.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And of course, anything with the word SolarWinds in the acronym, I feel like is a huge win. So we appreciate that, certainly. Can you provide us with a couple of examples of the dashboards that you've created within Oculus?
Oh, yeah, that would be great. I've selected 8 Oculus case studies we can look at to show some good examples. Now, hopefully, these will give our audience some ideas of what they can use in their own IT environments and how to create a meaningful picture as a knock display. The first one, that example, shows a geographic orientation on an exploded state view. And this is helpful as if we have regional outages that we're tracking, we can see those displayed on a graphic orientation or geographic orientation of the United States. The second example shows an array of router icons and tunnels for JRSS. That's the Joint Regional Security Stacks, and many people have heard about those because they're now in place to filter communications between all different agencies and the Department of Defense. You'll notice on the lower right-hand corner also, to make it easier to determine failover status, there's a little legend that shows primary, secondary, and tertiary tunnels for JRSS. Example 3 is an array, another array that's for virtual Palo Altos, and they were small table-like arrangements for the monitoring as a service, so that we could line those up by each state. Example 4 is ArcSight, and this is where we're showing monitoring as a service because we're showing the dependency on syslog, even though syslog is not a part of ArcSight itself. If syslog isn't feeding information into ArcSight, or the syslog service aren't, then effectively ArcSight is as a service is down. Another monitoring as a service example is number 5, and that's our ITSM, which is really a combination of Remedy and Kinetic, and we're showing NetScaler load balancing as a dependency for the web interface. I'd like to move on to what we developed at the National Guard Bureau remotely to monitor Puerto Rico. And there's 3 examples for that. So example number 6 shows an actual customer generated diagram that the customer is familiar with. So we used that as our backdrop for the tool and superimposed the active nodes on top of that. Example number 7 is another geographic display of Puerto Rico. Now, this was particularly useful during hurricane recovery because we could see geographically what sites were down, and that correlated with where the most hurricane damage was. Example number 8 I included, and it's a security display for all of the security devices and the network itself. And it was an interesting tool to put together because it shows perimeter boundary, cross-domain solutions, and controlled interfaces.
Yeah, so that's all pretty awesome. So each of these examples you've effectively built yourself. And it looks as though, from what I can see across these different examples, these are dashboards that, of course, are directly built within the Orion platform, using data collected by Orion from your infrastructure, and you make those dashboards available to your IT operations teams, your security teams, and management, basically all the people who need to see them. And honestly, it's pretty incredible. It looks pretty hard and like a ton of work that you had to put in to do this. Would you mind taking just a couple minutes to explain to the audience how you go about building these dashboards and why you do it?
The Oculus tools are actually very easy to create using Network Atlas. I create a graphics-based background image and then just overlay existing SolarWinds active nodes on top of that. A couple of tips when you're making your background image is you really need to be careful about the colors you select, because you want to avoid any colors that you would encounter in alerts. So you don't want to put a node that you're monitoring on a red background, because if it goes down and turns red, it'll be very difficult to see. The other thing to keep in mind is that for visibility, size really matters. If you get too small and it becomes an eye chart to try to read, then it will be difficult for people to follow the status of what you're trying to monitor. So Oculus tools really improve event management. And the way they do that is they're easy to use by tier 2 teams and the service desk for like 24/7 monitoring. And by having the tools up on a heads-up display, it really reduces the time it takes to detect problems and outages. And you can be proactive in your approach to event management instead of being reactive and having the service desk wait for somebody to call with a trouble ticket.
So, hey, that's great information, Dave. The fact that you can build all these dashboards, you can make them available and just drive a ton of value for the organization, I think is incredible. Now, no conversation these days would be complete without us also talking about the global pandemic that we're all experiencing. You and I are sitting here on a Teams call, as opposed to sitting in a studio doing this recording, which is how we would normally do it. And of course, at the same time, the need for lots of people to work from home is increased, right? And obviously you're at home, I'm at home. How does this actually affect the Army National Guard? And how do you use SolarWinds to support this particular use case?
When the Army National Guard implemented a COVID-19 stay-at-home work policy, it forced a drastic increase in the use of remote VPN for telework. And that resulted in very high utilization on our Cisco ASA firewalls that were acting as the concentrator for VPN connections. At that time, the director of the National Guard Bureau identified several emerging requirements and asked that we develop something immediately to give visibility to that large increase in VPN use. And that's where SolarWinds came to the rescue. So the director wanted us to develop a NOSC tool to display VPN context status at the enterprise and state level, and also to provide daily VPN RA utilization reports. And the reports would be used to accurately assess if the current Cisco ASA firewall capacity was being exceeded or if it was adequate. And then lastly, in order to give visibility down to the customer, the director wanted to embed the VPN tool into the GKO SharePoint portal so that anybody who was on the portal would be able to see directly the status of the VPN context on the ASA firewalls.
Well, let's go into a little bit of detail on that. How'd you do that?
So the process itself is very simple. There's 3 steps. You establish a direct link view-only account in SolarWinds. Then, for any particular view, you capture the URL and change just the end part to make it a direct link URL. Once that's done, you have the URL and you just embed that into the web or SharePoint portal.
That all sounds pretty easy. So I'd like to wrap up our discussion today with a little bit of more discussion around alert notifications and how SolarWinds helps you with conducting your IT investigations.
Well, here's a tip. You need to be mindful of what you choose to alert on because it can generate a lot of email traffic. What I do is I consider directing the email alerts to a specified folder for alerts. And I don't let them just populate my inbox because it can overwhelm that. Remember that naming scheme we talked about? The naming convention becomes really important when setting up your alert, trigger, and reset conditions. It's important to always use the same conditions for the trigger and reset to ensure you get the same alert when the node goes down and also when it comes back up. There are trigger conditions and reset conditions, and then the corresponding actions are trigger actions for your email and then reset actions for your email. And I often find it good to use information strings in my emails to list the node and the duration of the outage when you get the reset email.
Okay, that all seems pretty awesome. I understand that you also use our IPAM module, though, too. Can you share a little bit about what you do there?
Yes, so to use IPAM as an investigation tool, it helps to have a good setup plan, similar to what we used for Network Configuration Manager. I use a naming scheme that identifies location, and I enter multiple smaller categories and subnets whenever possible to divide things up that I can look through and actually find the information that I want to investigate. So if you have a large number of subnets, you may also need to adjust the default scan interval. The default is 4 hours, and I changed mine to 7 days. And the reason I did this was to prevent a backlog of scheduled scans, and you can always perform a manual scan whenever needed. So we use IPAM to help identify unknown rogue devices that are discovered during ACAS vulnerability scans. IPAM keeps historical records for subnet scans, so information on hosts is still available even if the device has been removed from the network. This is really an unintended use for IPAM, but it's been really helpful for our investigations on rogue devices.
That's awesome. So effectively, if you kind of break this all down, you have one of the largest networks in the world. You leverage SolarWinds to help you monitor both at the enterprise level and at the state level. And then at the same time, as you look into how you use these various things, you're able to help meet your continuous monitoring requirements, your compliance requirements. And I mean, honestly, it's a lot. And that's fantastic. I am thrilled that you're able to get that much value out of it. Dave, it's time for us to wrap up the session. But I've got to say, it has been truly enlightening having you as a guest. I want to take a moment to thank you, and also to thank you for taking your time out of your day to share with our community what you've been able to do with SolarWinds. So thank you.
Well, it's been my pleasure, and thanks for having me.